Hi, I'm Nate. You're watching Photolearningism. Thank you so much to everybody who took a moment to vote in the poll for what kind of tool you wanted to see this week. The photo editor option won out, and today we are going to dig into Photoshop 2021. Let's do it! Okay, so once again, I'm Nate. This is Photolearningism. Thank you so much for joining in. If this is your first time, thank you so much for joining in. I do a lot of work here to build a community of learning to surface the cheap or free art technologies so that you can know about them and make good use of them. Today, we're going to do a commercial product, and we're going to look at Photoshop 2021. It's an Adobe product from the suite of things that they've put out. So we're going to be looking at it today from the angle of photography, of photo editing, and I'm going to attempt to take the perspective of coming in this as a beginner, somebody who may not have a lot of preconceived notions of where things should be or where they work. And I've done a little bit of digging just so I can give you something of value out of this, but I'm trying to look at it from that kind of mindset and that kind of view. So understanding that, this is Photoshop 2021. It is newly downloaded just within the last day or so. So it's very recent. And I'm going to look at it by bringing in an NEF, which is a Nikon raw image format. The first thing that I will note is that as I do that, I'm dragging it in here and it should, spin it up, is that Photoshop includes its own raw loader, just called Camera Raw. And I found this to be quite powerful. They did a really good job designing this tool to have some neat features. It's literally like a little mini photo touch-up. It actually compares very nicely against things like Raw Therapy and Darktable and other raw loaders that have a lot of adjustment built into them to tap into the raw data. You do have all the exposure controls to tweak that up and down. You do have all the usual highlights and shadows and whites and blacks that you would expect, texture for drawing out the kind of the finer details or micro contrast, that kind of stuff. And you can kind of step through the different options to tweak the color and the tone, to touch up the curves, which are really the range of color. You can tweak that by just dragging the band up or down. You may be familiar in some cases with that, or if I were coming at this for the first time as I'm trying, this would be fairly intuitive to kind of play with just a bit and start to see the immediate effects of what that can do. All right, to play with the visible spectrum there. It does have some really interesting tools along the side here, which also give you more control over what you're going to do with the image. This is a little bit unique to this loader in that you can do some spot fixing, which is in a way kind of like advanced masking in a way. You're doing a touch up within this, and let's say that I was unhappy with this kind of leaf. I had this heal tool, which is the Band-Aid, where I could try to replicate what's around it. And what's happening here is that it's trying to use intelligence to guess, based on the layout of color and the patterns, how to remove it intelligently, which is pretty cool. It's trying to remove and auto-fill in that space based on what you're dragging into and selecting and working on. So that's kind of cool. There's also a clone option, which is a very similar premise. And you have control over how much feathering is done, which is kind of the blending of it, the overall sizing of it, and the overall opacity, which is the transparency. So coming at this, again, as a beginner, this can be a little bit intimidating just to step through at least this particular loader. The layout is kind of non-traditional in that there is nothing over here, which is where you kind of expect to begin. There's nothing along the top, which is another common place. I know this is becoming kind of a popularized area of where the modules go, but my big beef with that is that you have to kind of, first of all, observe that there are other buttons here. I did not notice that the first time I stepped into this, because this offers a whole lot more that you can do. It has adjustment brushes where you are actually painting on your adjustments. That's a really cool feature, by the way. where you could make adjustments based on color and temperature, or even after the fact, if I wanted to adjust just this part of it here and I wanted to tone that up a little bit, you can see that adjustment taking place. It's a really neat idea where you can almost selectively adjust that one piece, and you can do that in other tools. That's not to say this is native to Photoshop, but it's a really slick approach of how you edit and how you apply updates as you work through it. So again, looking at this as somebody stepping into this with just maybe a little bit of knowledge, I want to figure it out. This particular interface is hard. It is difficult to look at this and intuitively kind of work your way through. More so is the fact that you might look at this and go, well, okay, how do I save it? How do I keep what I've done? Now, I have a done button down here, and I'll show you what happens when I do that. It just goes away. And that's not very clear as to what's actually happened. So if you go back and look where the image is, it doesn't tell you it's doing this, but it makes this XMP. Now what that is kind of a temporary collection of all the changes and modifications that you've done on that image. It keeps it separate so it doesn't destroy or modify your original raw image, but it's like this layer on top of it that gets maintained, and it will continue to maintain that. If I drag that same image back in here, let's watch what happens. It will reload it into the raw loader, and it will actually have all those things I have. You can see that adjustment that I painted on, that's still there, but the raw image itself is untouched. And I can prove that by doing this. If I were to cancel out of this and then bring us back into my images, what I can do is I can actually get rid of this XMP. In case I was unhappy with how that was going, and then I could reload that again and wipe the slate clean and start over. All right, so that to me is pretty confusing in that you wouldn't really be able to guess your way through that intuitively. It took me some trial and error to kind of find my way through this, and it's not well explained, and I think that's kind of a misstep for this process. It could be much clearer as to what's happening when you work on this. And further, if you want to take the next step on this image, what you have to do is you have to say, I believe, open as a copy. That finally brings it into Photoshop beyond the raw loader and gets you going into that tool. So again, that could be better. There's some real power, some real features, don't get me wrong, but I think the interface looking at this as a beginner step is a little too much. All right, so now getting into actual Photoshop of what we have to offer here. I'm not going to go too deep because you could go on and on with this and that would just go on and on. But we're going to touch on some other things here that are around. All right, you do have the typical tools that you would look for, or if you're a beginner, this is really well done in that as you start to look at these tools and things, Adobe did this really cool thing where they give you this pop-up visual demo in the Learn How. This is really brilliant because if you have no idea what these tools are about to do, this gives you the very quick explanation, and you can actually get a very quick sense of, oh, okay, well now I get it. Now I can see if this is valuable to me and what I want to do. So at this level, coming in as a beginner with not much experience or no experience, this is a beautiful idea. And I will applaud that. I think that's fantastic because it really gets you off on the right foot. Similar to the raw loader, you actually have a selection of tools that's not that far off from that. You do have some additional things where you can do something called framing. This is a really cool idea where I can map off a section of space, and you can adjust up here the kind of shape you're working on, but let's just presume I'm working on a circle. And in the example, you can kind of see what that's going to do, where they're using a coffee cup, and they're going to drop something on the side of that and just map it in and adjust it and work within that frame. It's a cool idea. There's other ways to do this, again, in other tools, but this is a really nice, fancy, shortcut way of getting that kind of effect done, and I'll demonstrate that. I'm going to bring in another raw image here of something else and drop that on top of my frame. So again, it's cool. It kind of works with raw inside of this once you're working on something else. And there we go. You can kind of see how that's now its own separate object within that framing. That's pretty cool. All right. There are the cloning tools that go out there. If you're unfamiliar with that, that is a similar approach to the healing brush we just looked at in the raw loader, in that you can select a space. I'm going to get out of this layer here. And the way it works is that you have to click on a space. If I press Alt and hold, it changes the kind of the crosshairs. And that is the kind of space I want to work with. I'm going to zoom in here, Control Plus, and just get a little closer. And I want to say I want to replicate this space here. And already this is another cool feature here, is that it's somewhat showing you what will come about from the area you've selected. I could change this space to say, okay, well, I want to start instead from here. This is the preview of what you'll be drawing out. So that's kind of neat, in that you can get a sense of what you're actually going to start drawing. What's actually happening here is that I selected a space of pixels, and this is duplicating it really. It's cloning it to the space that I decided to draw it. And you have a lot of control over the brush, if you can use that kind of term for this tool, the size of it, the hardness of it, how well faded it is, how transparent it is. There's a lot of controls here that you can play around with to do it. It's a nice, intelligent feature. It's a little bit more advanced than other tools I've used. So I think there's some really good possibilities there, especially if you're going to do photo manipulation. This is a really powerful tool. This is where Photoshop really shines, in my opinion, because it does have a lot of commonality with other tools. It does have painting, which is that's a lot of tools will do that. It does give you good control over the brush chips and things and the style and all that. Again, these are all very common things. It has smoothing up here, which is the degree to which it's going to attempt to auto-correct what you do. If I put that up really high, you can see how it's working hard to maintain how smooth that is. If I were to knock that down, that becomes kind of rough and a little bit more freeform, which is maybe what I want when I'm painting, but that's giving you a degree of smoothness to it, which you may or may not use. It's a nice idea. Workspaces, which I've seen in other tools. If you're not familiar with the concept of workspaces, it's under Window. That is just changing the kind of overall layout to maybe better suit what you're trying to do. And there's a couple different pieces of this. There actually is a photography layout, which I'll bring that up so you can see. That just focuses, again, a lot more on the concept of cloning, blending, correction, tweaking, color grading, doing that kind of stuff. Using the blur tool, which, again, that's a really, really good tool to have here. And that does not pop up in a lot of other tools. This actually is a pretty distinct feature of Photoshop in that you can actually selectively blur areas as a brush. Now, I know that other tools like Krita has the brush engine where they tell you that you can make kind of a custom thing to do this. I haven't played with it very much, and I think you might be able to get close to something like this, but this is already baked in. It's very easy to understand once I understand these controls, and to make good use of that. And there's a couple different modes and things of the tool that can change what it's actually going to do, the intensity, the amount of strength to it, how blurred it's going to be. And you can start to see it. It's because this is a very, very high-res image. It's hard to see it when you're far away, but you can see the more I work on this, the more blurred it becomes. There we go, more pronounced. That can be a really useful thing if you're trying to suggest more depth in the picture, to try to suggest on a more psychological level that something is closer. If you blend the background well, if you blend it very carefully, blurring with a degree of gradient to it, it can help suggest that there's more depth to it than was actually already there. It's kind of a cool effect. I see a lot of people doing it very tastefully. If it's overdone, you can tell, and it starts to look fake. You may have noticed that maybe from Snapseed, there's a kind of a focal point feature where you can apply this ring of gradiated blur, and it looks cool for some things, but you can kind of tell because sometimes it'll overlap an object. Like if I do my hand, it'll blur the bottom as well. And unless you can mask that out, it starts to look like, ah, yeah, that's just a filter. Okay, that doesn't really look real. The eye can tell something is wrong. So using the selective blur as a brush is a really cool idea. There's also a burn tool, which is kind of a slightly different twist on that, where you can take something and you can make it darker, which is a really interesting idea. You can give it a little more tone to it, a little more contrast perhaps. Really interesting idea. So again, the burn tool. We're going to make that a little bit bigger because this is a high-res image, and you can see what that's doing. It adds a little bit of degree of pressure to it, a little bit of intensity to it. There's a text type tool, which if you wanted to get into adding text, that's, I don't have to explain that. That should be fairly intuitive. But you may also be familiar with something called smudge. Again, I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but this is just how we discover things stepping through this. So this is a different concept in that I can change the strength and let's see, the size of the brush here again. I'm going to make it bigger so we can see. And this is really just as if I was taking my finger in a painting and just, or if it was charcoal, if it was lead or graphite or something that will smear by another tool or medium, this is what's happening here, in that we're actually just smudging it. That can get useful if you're looking to maybe drag some color on top of something, maybe as color splashing, or maybe just to do a minor correction. By that means, that's another choice where you could smudge it and you can drag it in. One other feature worth mentioning here, because it's very innovative, is this idea of 3D objects within Photoshop. And this is a thing I have not seen again in any other tool. To demonstrate this a bit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus in on this layer here, and we're going to go into 3D, and we're going to say new 3D extrusion from selected layer. It's going to ask me if I want to hop into the 3D workspace, which again, it's not going to take tools away from me. It's just laying things out differently so that I can focus in on the 3D aspects. So once it finishes calculating that, here we go. We're going to switch to 3D workspace. And there we go. And what this is doing now is it is giving me the ability to manipulate this object as a 3D object. And you do this by kind of clicking and dragging along the axis that you want to work with. And some of this is a little bit of trial and error because I'm figuring out the interface. Again, just being honest as a first timer here. But you can see how this is actually mapping this to a cube in this case. It has the capability to cast a shadow on something. There's some really interesting graphical properties to how this could be used. It wouldn't necessarily be used in your traditional photo touch-up because we don't usually convert things to 3D in a lot of ways. But it does have some interesting prospects for the graphical design piece of this. And again, I don't want to get deep, this is more on photography. But I wanted to mention that it's there because it's really cool innovation, really cool technology of how to use a picture in this case. So it's very simple to bounce right back into the workspace that we were. I'm going to hop back into photography so I get the tool set that we were looking at a minute ago back, but that's what it is. Those are a lot of the high-level tools. There are some really super advanced pieces of this where you can do blending, you can do special selection and cutout and intelligent paint over where it will only paint certain things. That all gets very, very, very deep, and I don't want to go too deep on this because there's just so much in this tool to do. So you might be asking, okay, well, having looked at this, is it worth the monthly fee? And my answer to that is maybe, which I know is kind of a cop-out, but I'm going to say maybe because a lot that's here you will find in other tools. You will. There are some niche areas like the intelligence behind the blending, like the intelligence behind selection and paint over and smudging. A lot of tools I've seen, while they're good, they're not this developed in that area. And if you intend to get into some really, really in-depth photo manipulation, this is a good option to consider because Photoshop is a pioneer in that field. They were really the first ones to develop this concept of manipulation on that level. And so I'll credit that to them. I'll say the tool is definitely powerful and it has something to offer you. Now, that aside, I do think that there's a lot of playing field, and it feels like there should be more. To add a monthly price to this, there should be something more. Because to add those couple of things, I don't know that to me personally, that would be worth a reoccurring monthly fee that I have to pay for to the end of time to use this tool. But it is intriguing, innovative technology, and I know that they're working on more and more to add to this. And I would say definitely try at least the trial. I would encourage you to do that because you'll lose nothing by doing that. And again, there are some really, really advanced pieces to this tool, which are at least worth exploring. The workspaces are a good way of organizing your things. The powerful loader, the raw loader, is an unusual thing to see actually with a photo editing tool. That doesn't usually come coupled with something that powerful. The level of intuition gets better as you step into the tool. As I pointed out, that's a strength to how this fits in, and that can be a learning curve to other tools, and that the instruction manuals themselves, the guidance in getting through the tool is very difficult. So on a scale of 1 to 10 for Photoshop, I would give it an 8. I would give it an 8. Kind of discounting the price of it, I would give it an 8. There's a lot of positive things at the stable tool. Definitely try it out. So once again, this is Photolearningism. I know I talked for a bit there, so thank you for sticking with me. If this was helpful for you to see, to get kind of an intro level of Photoshop to see what it can do, please give me a thumbs up to let me know this was helpful. If you want to explore it some more, also consider subscribing because you don't want to miss out on the amazing things that are going to come up in the future as we continue to explore new wonders and tools. And consider leaving a comment. Join the conversation, join the community of learners, ask and be family friendly. So thank you so much for being here. See you at the next video.